All right, so I just sent Leo dial-in information, so hopefully he'll at least be with us by audio.
Okay. All right, I think we probably should start the program and then see if we can join us.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, thanks to everyone who's joined us bright and early on a Saturday morning. This is the panel called Enforcement in a Fragmented World. My name is Ed Kim. I'll be moderating today's panel. I'm a founding partner of Krieger, Kim and Lewin, and I'm a former federal prosecutor here in Manhattan. I'll be doing some intros of folks. Before I do that, let me just read the required CLE text before we get started. So the Asian American Bar Association of New York is certified by the New York State Continuing Legal Education Board as an accredited provider. This program has been approved in accordance with the requirements of the CLE board for a maximum of 1.5 credit hours, in which 1.5 credits will be applied towards the requirement of diversity and inclusion. This program is suitable for non-transitional New York attorneys only. You must have pre-registered and confirmed for this program to receive CLE credit. The first page of the written materials that were emailed to you is an attorney affirmation, which you must complete and return to cle@albany.org. 2 codes will be announced during this program. Record the codes on the attorney affirmation. Please return your affirmation as soon as possible within 1 week so that we can send you your certificate. You received a link for an online evaluation for this session with the written materials. Please kindly complete the evaluation so that we can improve our programs. This program is being recorded for archival purposes. Your continued attendance in this program constitutes your consent to transmit, record, and use your voice and image for this purpose. And as I mentioned, I'll be reading 2 codes during this program, one somewhere during the program and another at the very end. Although frankly, everyone who's shown up here on Saturday morning should get CLE credit instantaneously, but we'll follow the rules. So as I said when we started, let me just see if, it looks like Leo's been able to join by phone. This panel is entitled Enforcement in a Fragmented World. I think we started out with the idea to primarily focus on the changing landscape in white collar and in the enforcement space due to recent events. And I think it's evolved a little bit given everything that's going on. And the theme of this conference, we thought about the importance of talking about diversity in the white collar and enforcement space in the practice area that we're in, and to specifically address some of the challenges and opportunities for APA practitioners. With that, I'm gonna give maybe I'll start with some brief introductions of the panelists. And one thing I'll just note as well, during the program, if you'd like to submit questions, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll most likely try and field some of the questions towards the end, but we may also integrate them as we speak. Before I do the panelist intros, let me just say that I'll give a blanket disclaimer and others can add if they feel the need to, but especially for our government folks, I think the views expressed by panelists are individual views only. No one here is speaking on behalf of any of the institutions with which they're affiliated. So with that, let me give some brief intros and we can get started. I'll start with Charu, Chandrasekhar, who's an Assistant Regional Director in the SEC's Division of Enforcement and leads the division's Retail Strategy Task Force. Unadine, who's an Associate General Counsel in IBM's Investigations and Regulatory Group, and until recently she was a partner in Fried Frank's Cybersecurity and White Collar Defense, Regulatory Enforcement and Investigations Practices, and is also a former AUSA or federal prosecutor from the Eastern District of New York. We have Joon Kim, who's currently a partner at Cleary Gottlieb, and prior to that, served as the acting U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. And hopefully, Leo, give us a shout if you're there and you can hear us. We have Leo Tsao, who's a Principal Deputy Chief of the Money Laundering and Asset Recovery Section, also known as MLARS, of the Criminal Division of the United States Department of Justice in DC. And Leo, do you want to just give us a shout if you're on and able to hear? Okay, so we're having technical difficulty. So I think what Leo means to say is that he's delegated the authority to all the other panelists to speak on behalf of the DOJ, which is great. Because I think we've got some good questions for the Department of Justice. So why don't we kick things off first by talking a little bit about the topic of the day, which is COVID, which obviously has had a huge effect on the legal industry as a whole. But maybe we can talk a little first about how this practice area, the enforcement space, has been affected by the pandemic. And I should just take 1 minute to just note, when we're talking about the enforcement space, for those who may not be familiar with the practice area, we're talking about sort of like white collar criminal enforcement, regulatory enforcement work, generally government facing work involving criminal or regulatory issues. How I think it'd be helpful to hear from some of you about how the practice has been affected by the pandemic, and maybe which we've obviously seen a lot of changes. We're all sitting in our respective homes right now, but which changes do you think will be temporary versus more permanent? And Joon, maybe that's something you can kick us off to discuss.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Yeah, I mean, in the white collar enforcement space, on the defense side and the private practice side, I think like any other practice, and frankly like the rest of society, when the pandemic first hit, there was a lot of dislocation, a lot of disruption of the work, and probably more so than other practice areas, there's a lot of what we do in this area that you felt that you needed to do in person. A lot of what we do was the gathering of facts, interviewing witnesses, confronting witnesses or individuals who are suspected of wrongdoing, talking and negotiating with the authorities, the DOJ, SEC, other authorities. A lot of those things were done in person, and there was a view that you can't do it as effectively remotely. And so there was a period of time, I would say, March, April, when things sort of slowed down, almost ground to a halt, because no one was really sure how to deal with it. Things got put off. No one was sure how long this was going to last. And interviews or investigations that were ongoing were put on hold, with the hope that soon you could meet in person, and soon you could do that interview that you were planning to do in person, or that meeting with the DOJ. You asked, well, can we make that presentation when we can meet in person? But then we soon realized that Easter came and went, and it didn't disappear, and we were stuck in this world for the foreseeable future, and everyone started to adjust. It's taken some time, but things have picked up now, and interviews now are taking place via Zoom or WebEx. You are having presentations and meetings with authorities through video conference. A lot of what the document review now is being done from various people's homes. So it has been a period of adjustment like everyone else. I think it might have taken a little longer because so much of what we did was in person before. But I think now we're sort of back. We're at the point where we realize this is we're going to have to work this way for at least the foreseeable future. And with respect to your question of how much of this is permanent, I still think there's going to be a lot of what people do in this area that is still better done in person, like assessing people's credibility. Especially if you're representing individuals, these are very sensitive, obviously, issues for them, and you don't want to deal with those things unless you have to through a phone call or a video conference. So I think those parts are probably not. That's probably temporary. But I think sort of the less crucial meetings, the less crucial conversations where you used to fly across the country or sometimes to other countries to just have a meeting or a kickoff meeting or that type of thing, I think is probably more a thing of the past.
Yeah, and I think it'd be good to hear the government side of the coin on that question as well. And before we do that, though, Joon, when the pandemic first started, I know, I represent a lot of individuals too, and the conventional wisdom was sort of like, yeah, we can delay with the government. We can say, hey, I've never met this client in person. I can't bring him or her in for an interview, meeting and debriefing by video, and then doing the interview by video. And then all of a sudden, I saw some of the changes you described where people's perspective seems to have said, well, this is not going away anytime soon, so we have to kind of, make do. I don't know if you've seen opportunities to still sort of maintain, I guess, the line that people had taken early in the pandemic, which is like, well, this one is particularly sensitive, like we're going to need to do this in person, so we're just going to have to wait. I don't know if you've seen that play out or still see room to make that kind of a pitch to government regulators or prosecutors.
I think you can still make that pitch, but one part of this practice is on this side. Now, you don't have a lot of leverage. The other side holds most of the cards because they have the ability to arrest and send people to jail, and you don't. So if they push for it, it's hard to resist. I think for maybe critical ones where there isn't otherwise a need to proceed, you might still be able to push things off a little bit, but I think, less and less the authorities are willing to push it off because there's no real end in sight. I mean, I think if there was a view that, look, if we just wait a month, we can do this in person, what's the rush? That's a different argument than let's just put this off indefinitely until this pandemic disappears.
Yeah.
Probably not an acceptable position from the other side, and that's understandable too.
Yeah, and speaking of the power imbalance, I mean, emblematic of that is, Leo from the DOJ decides he doesn't feel like getting out of his pajamas, so he's just going to dial in by phone. So I guess Leo's joined now, so he can actually answer for himself. Yeah. But on the government perspective, maybe Charu, maybe you could give us your views just from the SEC standpoint about the same question that Joon had addressed.
Sure, and thanks for having me. And I should echo your disclaimer that my views expressed today are my own views, don't reflect the views of the staff or of the commission at the SEC. So I would say absolutely, just to jump off what Joon just said, we have, I think, all seen that this pandemic isn't going away. The state of affairs isn't temporary. And so the government and the SEC in particular have really been full steam ahead in terms of enforcement, investigating, and charging cases in this post-COVID context. And specifically, we have seen a significant rise in securities and investment fraud, I would say both linked to the pandemic and to the economic meltdown, but also in terms of exposing fault lines at companies that really hadn't been revealed before. In terms of the first category, absolutely seeing a huge rise in fraud relating to COVID products and services, coronavirus schemes and cures and frauds, market manipulation with respect to stocks in the COVID space and really in the healthcare space generally, but also other issues such as accounting, disclosure issues, insider trading, cybersecurity implications. So it really runs the gamut in terms of the full waterfront that we've seen. And so enforcement has been very, very active. I feel like because of the size of the economic repercussions, it's just been a massive, we're in a massive recession, obviously, that we will continue to be active in this space for years to come. It's not just a short-term blip. I think the enforcement consequences will go on for years and will lead to significant investigations and a continued heightened level of activity. And to Joon's point, the enforcement staff, the SEC, we've quickly adapted to this new normal. Early on in the spring, we were all thinking that we would pivot back to regular life pretty swiftly. Now I think we've all settled in for the long haul, and our view is that we have to get on with it, and we really can't just postpone investigations, witness interviews, testimonies, court dates for some indefinite point in the future. So we're absolutely posting ahead.
Thanks, Charu. And by the way, I think your audio, at least for me, your audio was coming in and out a little bit. Maybe it's a proximity issue, but just something I've observed at least. But as a white collar practitioner, I think your line about these investigations will continue for years to come really warmed my heart. But I don't know. I know. I guess a conventional wisdom is the SEC's investigations. A lot of them are sort of when you see sort of stock prices falling or economics degrading of companies, that's where you start seeing a lot of the market manipulation and things like that. And is that what's driving your comment about, seeing a little bit more of that, triggered by, I guess, like a recession, or is it more like something specific to the pandemic? Obviously, you mentioned maybe some very specific types of fraud associated with like maybe government funds and things like that, but I don't know if there's anything else unique to COVID that you're sort of in a position to comment on.
Right. Well, I would say companies of all backgrounds and shapes and stripes and sizes are suffering economic challenges, right? Whether it's home building companies or internet companies or consumer products companies. I would say every single company out there is facing an economic challenge. And for publicly traded companies, that has all sorts of implications in terms of disclosures and annual reports and quarterly filings, in terms of insider trading by corporate executives. So I would say it extends beyond the COVID product specific space, really to every company that might be registered or might be facing the SEC.
And I wonder, I think you're the sole representative on our panel who's in-house right now. If there's anything you have to add that might be unique to the in-house space.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I can really speak to how it's enforcement has changed from an in-house perspective, because when the pandemic started, I was actually impacted, and I went in the middle of July. So, I mean, I can echo what Joon said. I mean, from the private practice standpoint, frankly, the enforcement space was quite slow during the course of the Trump administration as a general matter. I mean, Charu sort of governs this space, but there was a lot of focus on retail investors and ICOs and things like that in the enforcement space, but not what we had traditionally seen in terms of, the bigger bank sweeps and whatnot. And that's sort of where my practice would have been more active. From the in-house perspective, I don't know that that's changed all that much. I mean, IBM, frankly, is the size of a small country, so we are always very active. But I can't really say sort of what the difference is between before and now.
And Leo, I think people have sort of talked about maybe bigger picture trends and things like that. I wonder if maybe it might be useful to hear just like from the day-to-day perspective, sort of pre-COVID versus now, what's sort of shifted for you, and we'll spend plenty of time talking about just sort of what it is you do on a day-to-day basis. But maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of any changes you've been able to see as a current DOJ prosecutor.
Sure. And can everybody hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. And again, I'm sorry for not being available on video, but yeah, so building a lot on what Joon said, I agree with everything he said. But in our practice at the money laundering and asset recovery section, the pandemic had a very big impact at the beginning. We have a very varied practice, unlike U.S. attorneys' offices or some of the other litigating sections in the Department of Justice, because not only do we do these large corporate prosecutions, and we do criminal and civil cases as part of our kleptocracy initiative to hunt down and repatriate assets stolen by public officials, but we also manage the remission process, the compensation of victims process, using either forfeited funds or also the United States Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund. So there's billions of dollars that we are sending back to victims. And we also manage the department's civil and criminal forfeiture program. So we are advising folks out in the field. So before the pandemic, there was a lot going on, and a lot of that work, as you can imagine, like everyone else's work, depended on interacting with a lot of other people within the section and the department, as well as the outside world. So when the pandemic hit and the Department of Justice went on a telework order, at least in the beginning, it was very challenging as we tried to figure out how to keep the trains running. But after that rough bump, we've largely been able to maintain our practice, and things are far from normal. But what we understood is that justice delayed is justice denied, not only for the public, but in some cases for the people and the companies that we were investigating as well. The statutes of limitations are still there, memories are fading, and so there certainly was an urgency within the section to not let the foot off the gas pedal, because I think if that happened, the cases ultimately were going to suffer. So like Joon said, we've had to adapt, and we've done many interviews of witnesses over the video or over the phone. For some very important or sensitive interviews, like when we're speaking to potential cooperators or other type meetings, we've done those in person with proper precautions. I think, as Joon said, it is important to have certain meetings in person. And again, I think we're trying to maintain the mission of the Justice Department by pursuing these cases effectively, but also, making sure that we're protecting ourselves in the process. So, as courts have opened up in recent months, we've taken guilty pleas, we've had hearings. We even had a trial that was scheduled to go in July in Mississippi, but the defendant pled the night before the opening statements. I suspect that the judge was actually trying to push the plea by forcing a trial in the middle of the pandemic. So we're also getting back to litigating as well. And I think the biggest change, just very briefly too, is just in addition to the work, is just managing the sense of community within the section. And, at least for me, a lot of my job was just fielding questions from people who would stop by my office, thorny issues, problems with their cases. And so that doesn't really happen anymore, the drop-ins. But so we've had to work hard to maintain regular contact through video meetings, through one-on-one sessions, so that we can maintain those relationships that are so important, I think, in any prosecutor's office, to make sure that we're talking with each other and understanding what's happening. So we look forward to getting back into the office, but and not struggling with weak Wi-Fi and these Zoom issues at home. But I think overall, though, we understand that the mission of the Justice Department requires us to move diligently, notwithstanding the pandemic, and I think we've done that.
Yeah, Leo, I mean, you brought up, I guess, I'm interested to hear that there's some instances in which you guys have, met personally with, cooperators and things like that. Because I mean, so much of, I guess, at least a stereotypically quintessential work of the prosecutor is, in the conference room, banging on the table, trying to work a witness. Yeah. And I've heard just anecdotally from both sides of the table that is obviously particularly challenging now. I don't know if you're hearing from your folks about frustrations about being able to do that by video, or if you guys basically decided those kinds of conversations will always happen in person.
It's case by case, but I'm just trying to think of the last few times where we've met with defendants who have wanted to cooperate, some high-profile defendants, high-profile cases, and so I think in all of those cases, the line prosecutor has requested authorization to do that meeting in person, and in all of those cases, we've granted those. So we're not forcing prosecutors to do it in person. But again, I think, a lot of the prosecutors in my section, I think across the Justice Department, are very committed to their cases and to to succeeding on getting a just outcome for these cases. And I think part of that, as you said, Ed, requires sometimes to meet in person, because I frankly don't know how you could meet with a potential cooperator over video. I just don't know how you would do that. You need to have that in-person interactions, I think, to be able to build a relationship and build a rapport, and also to assess somebody's credibility. So those requests have been coming in. They need to be approved, but we've given approval in each instance, so long as the prosecutor is comfortable doing it.
Okay, and that's literally happening with like masks on in conference room, or do you guys like what sorts of? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So they've been masks. People wear masks. They socially distance in conference rooms, and but still able to meet in person though.
Okay. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add on what we've talked about so far. So let's shift gears a little bit, maybe, and talk. I think it's part of the reason, as I mentioned at the start of this, that we, as a group, thought maybe we could shift our focus a little bit and talk about some issues of diversity in this practice area generally. Is I think it's quite rare to have a panel basically entirely comprised of APA practitioners who are current or former government attorneys. And there are, I know, those out there who may be thinking about government service or think about that as a path, or this practice area as something they may want to explore. So it might be helpful to hear from some of you about just maybe talking about some of the things that you've experienced personally in terms of rewards and challenges you've encountered, maybe in government service. And maybe we can start with a current practitioner in the space of Charu, if you want to maybe talk through about what your personal experience has been like in this area.
Sure. And how is my audio? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I think it's actually better now.
Okay, fantastic. So I will say government experience has been a tremendous professional opportunity for me. I was at a firm prior to joining the SEC where there were a very, very talented and really amazing partners who had spent a lot of time in government, and they all uniformly said government lawyering is the best possible professional path. It's just the best job you'll ever have. They really exhorted associates to go into government service, and it all has been borne out. It's just an incredible opportunity to be a lawyer for the US government. The professional experience really is unparalleled in terms of just the ability to really substantively master an area of the law, in my case, securities law, in terms of just the tremendous experience you get in on day one walking into the door. At my old firm, which was amazing, where I had just a terrific experience, I had perhaps 3 or 4 depositions as a young associate, and they were certainly not depositions of the CEO or the CFO. They were depositions of, you know, the secretary's assistant, and they were hard-won depositions to get, and you just don't have that opportunity to get up and stand up on your feet and to develop those professional skills. Whereas in the government, on day one, you'll walk in and you'll have 12 witness interviews within your first month. And there really is no substitute for that sort of hands-on, on-the-ground experience. And likewise, the quality of the lawyering in the government is very high. Government service attracts just really the best and brightest, especially in all of these metropolitan areas, certainly in New York. And you'll just work with wonderful colleagues. Your professional development will just be really on like a 45-degree angle trajectory. And it's just incredibly rewarding and gratifying just in every sense of the experience.
And thanks, Charu. I think, you know, as like I think I mentioned, aside, Leo's the other current government employee, obviously, and the rest of us are former government attorneys. And I think what you say resonates across agencies too. And Leo, I wonder if you might give some of your thoughts, and it would be helpful, I think, maybe for both you and Charu to talk a little. You're obviously both from different agencies, the DOJ versus the SEC. But Leo, maybe you can kick us off talking maybe about sort of addressing the same question Charu did, and maybe giving people a sense of what life as a line attorney looks like within DOJ. And I know you've been in several components, and maybe that'll be helpful as well.
Yeah, of course. So I've also been at a law firm. I've clerked for a judge, and I've been a prosecutor for 15 years in the DOJ. And I can tell you, being a line attorney in the DOJ, I was an AUSA in Philadelphia for 8 years. It's the best job I'll ever have. I have 4 kids. I tell each one of them that they should go to law school and become federal prosecutors, because it is really just the best job that I'll ever have. And I'm lucky enough to have that job right now. And I think the reason why it's so rewarding is because we're not here to win cases, right? We're here to do justice. And I know it sounds very cliche-ish, but when you are living it and you have the freedom to do justice, in the sense that, you know, you always confront the truth, you embrace the truth, whether it helps your case or hurts your case, because you have to do things the right way. That doesn't mean that we are not very vigorous advocates, and we sometimes don't throw sharp elbows when we are in litigation. But what that does mean, though, is that we never have to give up our ideals, and that, to me, is worth a lot. I don't make nearly as much money as Joon or some of the other folks on the call, but that's okay, because I don't make that much. Yeah, that's right.
Maybe Ed.
But that's okay, because I think that not to say that that their lives they also don't do the right things, but I think it's harder because they are representing clients, and my client is the U.S. and the U.S. has charged me with not winning cases, but with doing the right thing. And I have many stories that I won't tell here, but of times where I did exactly that, where I dismissed prosecutions because the circumstances just didn't warrant it. When bad things happen in a case, disclosures have to be made. You just do it. You eat the consequences, and whatever happens happens, because that's the right way to do things. I just think that it's a very powerful way to practice law. And I haven't met many people who have been line federal prosecutors, who have not said it really is the best job they've ever had. I think that's saying something. So I don't know if Joon and Ed agree with that too, but that's certainly my experience.
I think it's topped only by being a partner at Cleary Gottlieb, but maybe Joon can answer that. But no, I definitely, I took a path through the U.S. Attorney's Office too, and what Leo, I think one of the things you said is something I always tell people when they're thinking about that job too. It's the rare job where the job description, and I think this fits with the SEC also, is your mandate literally is to do the right thing, and I think that's a remarkable job to be able to have in law or in any field, frankly. Like it's really makes it unique. On this side, I sometimes when I have beef with the government, sometimes it's because I think I get the sense, or as an advocate, I feel like they're crossing a line from just doing the right thing to trying to win. And I think there is a distinction there, which in the law is also unique. It's like, Leo, you hit on that exactly too. It's not, at the end of the day, your job is not to win cases, it's to do the right thing and to do justice. And I think I found that to be true in my experience too. And part of that time I was serving under Joon. And I think having leadership who sets that tone and makes that clear to line assistants is a really awesome part of that job. And Joon, I don't know if you want to give a plug. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with everything that Charu and Leo said about having a job where the only mission is to do the right thing, but not just the right thing, but for the right way and for the right reasons. And Charu's point about just the professional experience you get substantively in terms of learning to be a lawyer, handle all aspects of a matter, from beginning to end, from small to big, in a way that you're called to do. But I think also important, and it's related to the do the right thing point, is that it is public service, and it's serving your community and your country, and that's an immense privilege. It's an honor. It's a responsibility that is something that affects and should affect your day-to-day work, and it's not true with other jobs, and particularly for people in minority communities like the Asian American community, where too many of our institutions don't fully reflect the diversity of our communities and our country. I think if you are a minority in one of these offices serving the public, it's all the more both important and rewarding. And Ed, Una, and Leo, you all know, when as an AUSA, every matter you appear in court, and you appear several times a day, you start by saying, Joon Kim for the government, or Joon Kim for the United States. And, you get used to saying that. But if you think about what that means, it's an important thing. I mean, in that courtroom, you are the United States of America, and that's not something you can say often in everyday life. And it means something. And so that's, sort of the additional, I think, value that comes from that type of service.
Yeah, and I was actually going to echo what Joon just said. I mean, there's no greater pride than being able to stand up and say, Unadine for the United States. I actually never said government. I would always say the United States, because that to me was more powerful. And there's a certain amount of credibility in front of the public, in front of juries, that you automatically have, because you are a prosecutor standing there to represent your country, to try and serve your community, to do the right thing. And that was a huge motivational factor for me. I think what we're also sort of missing is, just because it's such a mission-driven type of practice, the intense bonding that happens, the collegiality with your fellow line assistants, the people who you suffered through general crimes with will likely be some of your best friends for the rest of your life. And I don't want to be hyperbolic. I mean, people say, you know, we're in the trenches together and it's not quite war, but it is, you know, an intense bonding experience, and you cover for each other. And, you know, we always would say we have each other's backs. And there's something very powerful about that experience too. I mean, being an assistant U.S. attorney was probably one of the hardest things I ever did. And I think we're going to touch a little bit on this, but I was either pregnant or nursing or had a newborn at home, like for everyone except for one of my trials that I had when I was in the office. And that's really challenging and it's really hard, but there's no other place that I think is sort of conducive to the kind of growth, to the kind of camaraderie building, friendship building, and just sort of professional fulfillment than the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I think that goes for government service generally as well, to be able to give back to your community and serve your community.
Yeah, and I think I had wanted to talk through maybe some more general aspects of your jobs, and maybe we can work that in, because I do want to give space for us to talk. And you know, you had just alluded to this also about, you know, and a couple of you referenced this about sort of being a minority or an Asian American in this area, and that's something I want to give plenty of space to talk about. And to kick that off, maybe we can talk a little just statistically how things break out. And this is something that comes up in conversations a lot. I think as of like 2019, Asians, I don't think they break it up by Asian Americans, but Asians in the United States accounted for about 6.78% of the population. And from a similar time frame, Asian enrollment in law school for 1L classes was about 6.27%, so a little bit less than the representation in the population as a whole. And then when you look at law firms, and this is back in 2015, I think 11.37% of associates were Asian, but only basically 3% of partners, so underrepresented in the partnership. And when you go to the federal judiciary, in about 2017, there were only about 2.24% of federal judges were Asians. In the federal prosecutor world, from a much earlier time, about 2013, 2014, Asian Americans or Asians were about 5.2% of AUSAs, and of U.S. attorneys, so, you know, heads of the different offices in judicial districts, only 3 Asian Americans, so about only 3.2%. So, you know, as a group, we're definitely underrepresented in that area. And then if you look at elected DAs, so we've been talking a lot about federal enforcement, but state and county level elected DAs, only 4 total in 2016. So in this space generally, I think as we've probably all felt, Asian Americans, APA practitioners are underrepresented in our area. And we're all obviously too familiar with stereotypes about Asian Americans sort of being more suited for science and math and being doctors and engineers. And sometimes within the law that can manifest as a view that maybe Asian American APA attorneys should be transactional attorneys or IP focused. And I think the numbers of APA attorneys in like the litigation space is smaller, and then that's even more accentuated if you start looking in like the white collar and enforcement space. I think it'd be good also maybe to hear from the panelists about, you know, the kinds of challenges maybe you've encountered as an Asian American or an APA practitioner in the space. Maybe we can start out on the government side. Leo, maybe you can talk us through a little bit about, you know, what maybe have been some challenges being an Asian American in as a federal prosecutor.
Yeah, sure. And I have to say, I was surprised to hear those numbers. I just think it's surprising overall, as well as even particularly with respect to the number of Asian American prosecutors. When I was in AUSA in Philadelphia, I was one of 2 out of an office of 130. Even today in my section, there are very few Asian American prosecutors. And, you know, I don't know why that's the case. I know certainly the stereotypes that Ed mentioned, you know, the model minority, quiet, you know, suited for math, sciences, and technology, but definitely out of place in the courtroom. I think you can tell from my computer issues, stereotypes are sometimes problematic, right? But you know, I think the challenges we face, it's worsened by the fact that I think to many people, you know, Asian Americans look foreign. I still get asked by people what country I'm from. You know, I mean, it just sort of is what it is in a sense, but I think it does reflect the challenges that we face. And, you know, I remember being a prosecutor in Philadelphia where agents and defense counsel on occasions were, you know, quote unquote, pleasantly surprised to see that I could be an effective communicator or a tough prosecutor or not afraid to raise my voice. It was just something that was always in the back of my mind that I knew that I had to overcome that hurdle when I was dealing with agents or other prosecutors or defense counsel. And I think the second part of the problem is I think that, or one challenge is that it's hard to find mentors who may share some of the same stories as you and may understand some of the issues that you're going through better than you know, people who are not Asian American. And so I think these are challenges that we face. You know, I think, you know, Una and Joon and Charu growing up as prosecutors and enforcement staff, not having those mentors can be a real disadvantage, I think, to developing as a young attorney. So, you know, all I would say is for folks who are thinking about a career as a prosecutor or even a litigator, you know, there's going to be challenges for Asian Americans, but, you know, hopefully it will no longer be the case that it's so much as a novelty that we are Asian American litigators, but rather it's just, okay, that's perfectly fine. And people don't even give a second thought about it.
Yeah, I wonder if others have thoughts on that too, that maybe you experienced both, or Charu, maybe at the SEC, or others who are former federal prosecutors of, you know, what might have come up that was unique to being an, you know, Asian American practitioner in this space.
So I would say 2 points come to mind. I would echo absolutely all that Leo said. In my office, for example, I think there are probably 2 or 3 South Asian women. I'm constantly confused for the other South Asian women in the office. I'm sure a lot of us have experienced that phenomenon. But I would say there's really a flip side to going into government service as an Asian American, in the sense that you can really supercharge your professional development and your personal growth, I think, in a way that's harder in the private sector context. To my earlier point, you will go into government and you will get so much responsibility from your first day in the door, whether it's doing hundreds of witness interviews or standing up in court, as federal prosecutors do every single day. You will just grow so much as a professional and gain so much credibility. I feel like it's really a benefit to Asian Americans to be in government, historically a space in which we've been especially underrepresented compared to other fields, such as perhaps IP or transactional work. So you go into government and you earn your stripes. You develop a tremendous amount of credibility and experience. I feel like the experience is actually especially advantageous to Asian Americans because we can't get this elsewhere. And it really helps us overcome some of these stereotypes of being sort of the hardworking, nose to the grindstone, quiet mouse in the corner. You really show you can stand up, you can convince a jury, you can talk to the biggest partners at the top law firms in New York City and negotiate settlements. And nothing really instills confidence in you like that hands-on experience.
And I mean, I think in this area, like in other areas, I mean, we just have to have more and more people interested and entering the space, because I think Leo's right. I mean, the statistics you gave, Ed, were somewhat more promising, and it looks like an increase from when we were, certainly when I was a junior prosecutor. I did 2 tours in the U.S. Attorney's Office, Southern District of New York. First was 2000. There were not that many Asian Americans, and you know, and Preet, who was Preet Barar, who ended up being the U.S. Attorney, was a line prosecutor then with me. We started about the same time, and he's told this joke. We, among some of the agents, we were known as Harold and Kumar, which was it was fine at the time. This was less politically correct days, and we both liked that movie and I thought it was excellent. And it were friends, but you know, the reason we were Harold and Kumar is because there weren't any others. We were one Korean and I was Harold, by the way. And so, and once you have more and more people like that, and you got confused with the 1 or 2 others, and I think that type of thing is, if there's only 2 East Asian, you know, American attorneys than USA's, and it's more natural for people to try to confuse them. It's harder when there's a bunch, then they actually have to figure out who's who. It's harder, and by the end, you know, I think I don't think anyone was mistaking Preet for anyone else at that point. But so, you know, I think it's just having to get the numbers up, having it reflect more of the community. The startling figure, I thought, among the ones that Ed you gave us, was that there are only 4 elected district attorneys. I mean, that's amazing. I mean, you know, DAs, county DAs, I don't know. Yeah, you didn't even give us the number, the denominator, which has got to be hundreds, if not thousands, of that. There's only 4 elected district attorneys in the country is pretty shocking.
Yeah, and I think, you know, to build on what you guys have said, Leo, I think you talked about it from the standpoint of a challenge, like, you know, having Asian American mentors on the government side, which given, and I agree with all of you guys. When I looked at the stats, I was surprised too, because it seemed higher than what my experience had been when I was an AUSA. But finding mentors in the space, I was very lucky because I ended up serving under Preet and then Joon, and that was, to me, it was eye-opening. Was sort of like, oh, this is what it's like to serve under an Asian American U.S. attorney. But that's rare to find. But Charu, you bring up an interesting point, because maybe in some ways it can fast track you going to the government, because while I think those things are all important in government service as well, in some there's something about work as a government attorney that, and I'm not sure what it is, but it seems to be that you can almost like leapfrog some of those limitations that might be even more present at a law firm, where, you know, you need to know the right people maybe, or that's a big part of making partner, and maybe being a government attorney for some reason helps you kind of accelerate more quickly without necessarily having that. But that's, I thought that was an interesting point that you had made, Charu.
And just jumping off of that, and this is, I mean, a very, very utilitarian point, but I frankly think it's worth making, is when you are one of very few representing your race or ethnicity or whatever it is, you don't just sort of blend into the crowd. I mean, I think this is a time and an age where people are focusing on D&I initiatives more and trying to hire more diverse employees generally. And so I do remember when I was coming out of government, I heard the term sort of unicorn with respect to me a couple of times, which at the time was very weird. But now I realize they're just, because there is so few Korean women, Asian women coming out of the U.S. attorney's offices and government, and then going into sort of private practice at big law firms, that actually sort of made me something different, which was, I mean, I guess it's sort of unfortunate, but it's also, for, you know, for me personally, was kind of a good thing. But I also think the broader point is when you have, so in the Eastern District of New York, the AUSAs just did not reflect, the makeup of the AUSAs just did not reflect the makeup of the community that we served. And it is one of the most diverse, if not the most diverse communities in the entire world, covering, you know, Staten Island, Long Island, obviously all of Brooklyn and Queens. And I just think that's a problem. I mean, there were so many occasions when Black colleagues of mine would go into the courtroom and the judge thought they were the probation officers as opposed to the AUSAs. And one moment of pride for me was in one of my trials. There was one other Asian woman during the entire time that I was in the office. She was Vietnamese. I'm 5'6", she was 5 feet, but we would always get confused for one another. But we tried a case together, and it was her, me, and another one of our friends who's Indian. And it was a big 6-week-long drug trial, and the 3 of us stood up and said, we represent the United States. And I don't see why we can't get to that more often. I mean, Justice Ginsburg said that our job would be done when there are 9 women on the Supreme Court, right? Like, why shouldn't that be more of the norm? Why should sort of someone like me, be considered a unicorn? I think that's sort of what we want to achieve ultimately, is not even batting an eye that there are 3 Asian females standing up, trying a case together, representing the United States.
Yeah, Charu, your story makes me think of, you know, when I was in AUSA, I once tried a case. It was a Chinese defendant, and my trial partner was, I think, the only other Korean American AUSA, and it was tried in front of Judge Chin at the time. And the courtroom deputies got such a kick out of it, the marshals, that they actually staffed on that trial, like the 2 Asian American courtroom marshals that were in the building. So on day 1 of the trial, it was this like all Asian lineup. And I remember just thinking to myself, the jurors must be like, is this what they do when there's like an Asian defendant? They bring out all the Asian staff. But I had the same moment that I thought, yeah, why can't this become more normal? And actually there's some more added legitimacy when the government enforcement attorney or the prosecutor, I think, looks a lot more like the people that are getting prosecuted too, or there's you know, they're more of a reflection of the community. One thing that I thought would be an interesting perspective too is, you know, we're talking a little bit about being an Asian American, you know, government attorney or prosecutor, but you know, it's some might think, okay, then you leave. If for those who want to do that and then go to the private sector and sort of feel like, okay, now what happens? Like what are the rules of the game? Does it look exactly like every other area? And maybe now you're, say, at a disadvantage again of trying to get work because you're Asian American, and it's not like you're in a corporate space and you've got more, you know, people in the network who are Asian American as well. Joon, I wonder if I don't know if you have thoughts on sort of then making a leap back into the private sector, like any challenges or sort of unique opportunities you think are there for an Asian American former government attorney?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge of, you know, not having enough Asian Americans in the practice, and you know, the statistics you gave on law firm partners are worse than AUSA. So, and I'm sure if you got statistics from the decision makers at the clients, the statistics probably wouldn't be that much better. And so that challenge exists, I think, across the practice, frankly, the country, obviously. Some of the things that Charu said, I think it helps to have had the prior government experience, right? Because a lot of clients are looking for that. You know, people who have problems with regulators or prosecutors want to know that their lawyers have that experience, are known by the regulators and the prosecutors. So in terms of developing a practice, developing a standing within your firm, and all of that, I think this isn't just the case for Asian Americans, but it helps quite a bit in this practice area to have had the prior government experience. So it's one of, and not only having done that, but then gotten the substantive experience you get at those places at a relatively junior level of trials, which are hard to come by, as we've all said. And, you know, one of the few places where you can, as a relatively junior lawyer or even a senior lawyer, to be regularly in the courtroom litigating. You know, government lawyers do that more. It's just the government litigates more. And so, you know, all of that, I think, is immensely helpful in private practice, and in particular in this area. I mean, it's almost to the point where there's a lot of people who ask, and I don't think this is true either, but do you need to have been in government to be a senior or white collar enforcement or defense lawyer? Because in some jurisdictions, like New York, it can feel that way. I don't think that's true. There are a lot of very successful enforcement lawyers and partners at firms and practitioners and boutiques who have never been in a prosecutor or a regulator, but it definitely helps.
Yeah, and you, Joon, you mentioned decision makers at, you know, places. I think may be the only decision maker on this panel in that kind of position. I wonder, just from the in-house perspective, you know, just, you know, Asian American representation not being that high in the enforcement area, I don't know if that affects your perspective at all in terms of, you know, when you're talking with outside counsel or bringing them in. I mean, how does that affect your thinking in who and how you're evaluating outside counsel?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's just me who takes this approach. I think right now we're in a very lucky time where, frankly, the banks were leading the charge on this and in making sure that you present them with a diverse bench when you're coming in for a pitch meeting. And that has sort of resonated loud and clear. I do remember at times when I was in private practice, we were told, you have to come in with a more diverse bench. And I was pointed to as sort of like the token Asian that people were throwing into the pitch meeting just to like appear diverse. But there really is a huge emphasis on that right now. And I think it's shifted from let's just, be pro-diversity to we are actively going to try and hire diverse counsel. We are actively going to try and hire women. We are actively going to try and hire attorneys of diverse backgrounds. So I think that's a really great trend that we're seeing right now. And I certainly embody that. I'm new enough to IBM where I can't sort of change out all of the outside counsel we hire, but it is something that I look very, very closely at. There are times when you have sort of legacy outside counsel relationships that go back decades, and there's not a lot of disruption there to be had, but there are always opportunities for new professionals to come in. I think more and more companies, now it's sort of grown to be outside of the banks, are looking at not only what kind of diversity are you bringing into your pitch meetings, but who are you actually staffing on the matters? And it's not just sort of men versus women, it's across the board in terms of sort of gender identity and sex and ethnic background and racial makeup. And I think that's a really great trend, not diversity for the diversity's sake, but because there is real value in having diverse experiences and diverse backgrounds. And there are people who are exceptionally credentialed, who maybe have not gotten as much attention in, prior, before this trend sort of took hold, where now it's time to recognize there are a lot of really, really capable people. Let's just sort of broaden our horizons.
Yeah, and I think that's encouraging to hear. I think, maybe we all reacted in a similar way to some of the initial talk about diversity and inclusion on the in-house side of something like, all right, well, everyone's now into sort of the window dressing, but it's encouraging to hear that, that's taking root and maybe becoming more of just, I just want to see a range of colors and shapes and sizes at the pitch meeting, and then whatever you do after that, it's fine. But it's nice to hear that might be taking firmer hold in a deeper, more meaningful way. One thing I did want to give some time for us to talk about. We've been pretty focused on issues specific to Asian Americans, and you've alluded to this as sort of being the unicorn at the U.S. Attorney's Office. But maybe you and Charu both can sort of talk about, especially for like female Asian American practitioners, right? There's that added level of, maybe opportunity and challenge with that identity. But you can talk a little bit about what benefits and challenges you saw that were unique to that in government and enforcement work.
Or Charu, you want to go first?
Sure. So I would say government lawyering really is an amazing experience, really for anyone, but especially for women. And I think for APA women in particular, I would say for a couple of reasons. One, as a woman and as a mother, government lawyering really lets you stay in the game. You are developing incredible substantive expertise in some of the most important areas of the law, while you're able to balance a family. And if you look at I think that's borne out at absolutely every level. Our director of enforcement is a mother with 3 children, senior leadership across virtually every office, from San Francisco to Washington to Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Chicago. A lot of senior women who are also mothers in leadership. And that is because government lawyering really is a meritocracy. It's just the best lawyers rise to the top. The focus is on the excellence and the quality of the work. And there aren't the pressures of revenue generation, of billing hours that really are very challenging for all associates, but especially for young women associates at the early stages of motherhood. And so I think Yuna's career actually is a testament to the fact that you can really develop and grow substantively and professionally as a mother and as a lawyer, and you can really grow and really advance to the highest possible levels of your career. I think especially for Asian American women, we especially face the stereotype of being quiet worker bees, just sort of in a corner, just getting the work done for everyone else to shine. And as we've all discussed, when you're in the government, you're the one who's standing up in court. You're the one who's interviewing the CEO and the CFO. You're the one who's on the phone with the partners from the biggest law firms, telling them where they have to be and at what time and what the settlement is going to look like. And that just gives you so much confidence as a woman, as a person of color. It's really unmatched.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the government service is a great equalizer in terms of men versus women. I mean, I had my first kid when I was in private practice, and frankly, that was not a particularly successful experience in terms of balancing. If you hear screaming, that's one of them, actually.
I thought that was Leo.
Being a mom and being a lawyer. But the government is different, and I think it is in part, it is a meritocracy. I also think there's just an understanding that you will cover for each other. And when someone's out on maternity leave or paternity leave, someone else is going to take over those cases until that person comes back. And you're always running into court to cover for one another to begin with. And so I just think that that's the general culture. Having said that, I mean, I don't think I could have been a mom of 3 and sort of risen in the way I did had it not been for my time in government service, doing that while I was in government service. Having said that, I think that some more of the discrimination that I've experienced has been because I'm a woman rather than because I'm Asian. There were times when I would have turf battles over certain cases, investigations, and I was told once that was unbecoming of me. There was also a trial that we were trying to schedule, and after working around defense counsel, judges, and my trial partners' calendars and vacation schedules, the trial date that was picked was my due date for one of my kids, and so so I was asked if I wouldn't mind just stepping off and being replaced. But we changed it so that I came back with a 2-month-old to try the case instead. We pushed it off by 2 more months. But so the difficulties of being a woman in government service are still there to a certain extent. It is not easy. It is not sort of like the perfect work-life balance. You still have to make sacrifices and compromises, and it is sort of one of the hardest things that I've done to balance, but it was possible, and I'm grateful for that, and I would sort of do it all again in a heartbeat.
Yeah, I think it's, which is great to hear. I think we've been spending some time talking about, I guess, maybe highs and lows of being a minority practitioner in government service or on the private side of the same space. But there's actually another dimension that maybe with more negative connotations, like these days, there's defund the police. There's lots of sort of anti-law enforcement sentiment out there as well. And some scrutiny on people who've served as prosecutors. And I think some people question like, hey, how do you in good conscience, especially maybe as an Asian American, how do you serve as a prosecutor when you're working in a system with, maybe systemic racial disparities as a whole? And what's your answer to that? And Joon, maybe as a former prosecutor, you can talk about that. And Leo, if you choose as a current prosecutor, maybe talk about that as well. But Joon, be curious to get your thoughts on how you react to that.
Yeah, it's a fair question, and I think related to that question is if you have particular views or strong feelings about this administration, which I think some people do. The question is, how can you serve in that administration technically in the Department of Justice, and what's that like? And I think it's important to separate out the views about how the justice system should be run and is being run. Unquestionably, we have a need to improve how it's done. We have a need to revisit and continue to make sure that it is at all levels actually just and serving the public interest fairly. and then separate those views from the actual service itself, the actual people who are in there handling individual cases, vindicating the rights of victims. I mean, there's no, I mean, no one, on either extreme is going to say you can't have it. Let's not have a justice system. Let's not prosecute crime. That's obviously not the answer. And so I think, it is important to separate out those two things. I think it's important to encourage people who actually have a diverse view of how the system should be run, and actually differing views than people perhaps who have been in there for a long time, to actually go in and do the work. And I think there's a danger in demonizing anyone who's been in that role or part of a system that you believe as a whole is failing at its job of doing justice, which is a fair criticism if you look at it in terms of history and statistics and the like. So I think it's important to separate those things. It's hard to do. I think, but I think particularly at a time when there are questions about the legitimacy of some of our institutions and the way we've been doing things, it's important for people to find ways to contribute and to be a part of it.
Yeah, Leo, I wonder what your views are. Obviously, you're still a prosecutor. What you sort of think of, how you view your role, given all the sentiment out there recently, I guess in particular, about just is the system racist? Is it is it leading to different results in different kinds of communities?
Yeah, I agree with everything Joon just said, so I don't want to repeat what he said. But of course, there are serious issues that need to be addressed in the criminal justice system, and you don't have to look very far to know that a large segment of the population is now beyond frustrated, right? But it is curious to me though that I've seen these reports where people have been attacking one of the vice presidential candidates, that saying that she needs to overcome her role as a prosecutor. And it was just so interesting to me because, I've talked about this already, the ideals that you represent as a prosecutor are justice and fairness and integrity and honor, saying what you mean and doing what you say. And, I was trained as a prosecutor, again, to do the right thing and to never be afraid of the truth. And we have to have those limits in place, because as a prosecutor, you just have so much power over people's lives. Right. And of course, there are bad prosecutors, but virtually all the prosecutors that I've worked with have the same ideals as I just said. And so, to be clear, I'm not endorsing any candidates, but in terms of what we're looking for in our elected leaders, I think that those attributes are pretty good attributes. And so I definitely agree with Joon that you have to separate the system from the people, and reforming the system may require educating. I certainly know it's going to require educating the people within the system on the injustices and the inequities, but the people who are doing the job though and doing the best they can, I think that it's really strange to that people are saying that elected officials will need to overcome their prior work as prosecutors. I just think it's such a huge positive.
Yeah, I think when we were talking about this question as we were preparing for the panel, someone asked it a little bit more provocatively of, how many defendants did you prosecute who were, African-American and minority? And I think those numbers can be quite staggering. And I look back at my time as a prosecutor, and I would say, yeah, a lot of like my narcotics and violence cases, the numbers are so heavily skewed. But I don't look back with regret. I think that speaks to a lot of other problems in society, and but I think there is some benefit and maybe added legitimacy to putting somebody of color in the decision who's making those charging decisions. In some ways, I think that makes the system better. That was always my assumption. But it's good to hear your perspective on that as a current prosecutor, Leo. One thing that I do want to don't want to leave uncommented. Joon had made a comment, I think, about sort of, in particular, this current administration and the current DOJ. Obviously, it's a hot topic these days. People talking about not only just the system as a whole, but the politicization of the DOJ. And I think those of us in this space are familiar with comments made by the Attorney General that, some have interpreted to mean that, career prosecutors basically need adult supervision. And Joon, I wonder if you could maybe comment on how you see the role of career prosecutors. I think the assumption would generally have been that they're given autonomy, as Leo's talked about, the autonomy, the ability, the mandate to do the right thing. Do you think that's any less true in today's DOJ? And we won't make Leo comment on this one.
Yeah, no,
Thank you.
Perhaps he was referring, the Attorney General was referring to the career prosecutor's ability to join in video conferencing and things like that, and need extra supervision for success in that area.
Thank you.
But look, I mean, I think for anyone who has spent a lot of time in the Department of Justice and in any of its real litigating components, as career prosecutors, those type of comments give you a lot of concern about the philosophy, a philosophy that those comments might reflect. I mean, there is certainly some surface appeal and legitimacy to the argument and the statement that obviously, like any other agency or any other institution, the Department of Justice is headed by an Attorney General, and ultimately that person needs to be responsible for and stand by the decisions of that department. It's true as you come down the chain, each of the U.S. attorneys in the offices ultimately have their name on every document and have to feel comfortable that the right thing is being done, and if the right thing's not being done, to step in. I think what is probably not as commonly appreciated is the difference in the Department of Justice between those who are politically appointed and those who are career. And it's not just that one's more senior and one's less senior, and although that is generally the case, the political appointees come and go, and they are appointed by the administration at the time. So by definition, are sort of selected by one party and generally have a particular political view. The career people don't come and go with administration. In fact, you can't hire and fire career DOJ employees without cause and just replace them wholesale. You can replace the political appointees, and they do over time usually. And so the difference is that I think the Department of Justice is unique among the cabinet positions and the departments in that your function is not a purely political function. You are law enforcement. You are prosecuting crimes which need to and should be separate from politics, that it should be based on the law and the evidence. And in fact, there are a lot of countries, for example, where the top prosecutor in the country is not a political position, and they don't sort of technically report to the president in the same way that our Attorney General does. And so that's a way to sort of separate out the integrity of prosecutorial decisions. We're not organized that way, which is why there has traditionally been this view that as a matter of norms, there's no law that says the Attorney General can't opine on or change decisions of career prosecutors. Of course they can, and they do if they disagree. But there needs to be norms in place to ensure, actually, on the one hand, that in fact decisions about prosecutions, about sending people to jail and prosecuting them, is not driven by politics, but in fact by just the law and the evidence. And the way to ensure that is to give those who actually are working the cases, who are not political in the sense of being replaced with administrations who have been there for a while, to have a significant say over the decision, and for the influence and involvement of the political people who are more senior to be limited and constrained, so that there is both, actual lack of interference with those decisions, but also perceived lack of interference. And so, it's a long way to answer it, but it's not something that's obvious necessarily to sort of a casual observer and for people who haven't been within the department, which is why sort of some of those things have caused an uproar, including, for example, the firing of the Southern District U.S. Attorney, or we go back to the way Preet was fired, and then the most recently Jeff Berman was. So, some people might say, well, what's the big deal? These people serve at the wish of the president. But if there's a perception that people are being fired or hired to force them or influence them in making particular decisions, then that is a dangerous thing.
Yeah, and I think it undermines a lot of what we've been talking about, or sort of, to the extent people are already distrustful of a system like that, the idea that maybe decisions are being made for the wrong reasons and going against what Leo has talked about, obviously undermines the integrity. But I think I'm glad you sort of laid that out for people to understand too, sort of the way responsibilities are divided. One thing I do want to make sure is we're running out a little bit out of time. There are a couple of questions that got posted, and that I want to make sure that we can address them. One of them shows up as answered. I don't think we actually addressed this, but I'll maybe tee these both up and people can sort of weigh in on both. One person has asked whether panelists have any advice for local prosecutors interested in entering the federal regulatory space. Are there opportunities to build subject matter expertise while still employed as a local prosecutor with limited to no federal practice? So that's one question that maybe someone can take on. And another person has asked about advice for junior attorneys interested in applying to the DOJ or U.S. attorney's offices, given getting a job in those entities extremely competitive to begin with, but now with COVID, it seems like there's an extra layer of complexity. So any advice on sort of how to proceed, particularly for somebody coming off of, let's say, a term clerkship. So if you guys want to just sort of chime in on anything that you'd like to weigh in on, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, on the first question, I would say that, we in Eastern had a lot of former state prosecutors, former ADAs come in the door. And I don't think that there's any particular need for sort of federal subject matter expertise, frankly. I don't think a lot of people who come in from law firms have the kind of federal criminal law expertise that you ultimately develop. I think one of the skill sets that former ADAs bring to the table is you guys are in the courtroom and trying cases much more frequently than federal prosecutors are. And so there's like a certain artistry that you learn and develop in the courtroom, which can be extremely valuable, both in terms of just representing the office generally and helping other AUSAs in the office learn those skills. I think one of the knocks on former state level prosecutors is that because the volume is so great that you don't have as much of an opportunity to really develop really great legal writing skills in the process, brief writing skills, don't get honed over time, or understanding, sort of being able to sit down and learn the nuances of certain sort of complex statutes. And so I think one of the things is really focus on your developing your writing abilities and your critical thinking abilities, because I don't think the federal subject matter expertise is really what is going to hold you back at the end of the day.
Great. If we could have somebody maybe talk about the second question too, that'd be great.
So from the perspective of the Department of Justice, it's hard to get a job coming out of either directly out of law school or a clerkship, because at least for Maine Justice, the positions only come in through the honors program. I know some U.S. attorneys' offices do hire out of clerkships, but the honors program is really the route to get into the DOJ from right from from law school or clerkship. And I can tell you though, as someone who's on the hiring committee for the honors program attorneys, it's super important that you demonstrate that you have an interest in public service, and in particular as a prosecutor. That doesn't mean you need to work in a prosecutor's office. It certainly can be the case you work, for example, in a public defender's office. When I say work, what I'm talking about is as an intern or as an extern, perhaps during law school. But that's a really important thing that we're looking for. In addition to having good credentials, decent grades, and stuff like that. But really, it's showing the commitment, because it is highly competitive and there aren't that many spots. And so people are really looking for, the sections are really looking for people who have a demonstrated commitment, that they want to come to the department for the right reasons. It's not because they think it's cool or have, seen a TV show that shows being a prosecutor is really fun, but really they're committed to all the things we've talked about today in the mission of the Justice Department.
Great. Thank you for that, Leo. And I actually think we are out of time. But thanks to all the panelists for sharing thoughts. I think a lot of career wisdom. And thanks to the participants who've come out. Thanks to everyone for participating, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.